The rustling of the green leaves all around the hunter concealed the squelching of his black boots in the mud. The chilly Alaskan wind swept against him. It probably would have bitten into his skin if not for his thick jackets. Above him, the boundless blue sky and fluffy white clouds at least comforted him. No bad weather for now. His keen brown eyes watched for any signs of danger. Nobody lived anywhere close by. There was no rescue coming if anything had happened. Just what he liked. He felt the heft of his backpack as he hopped over a fallen decaying log. Around his neck, his silver necklace jingled. The hunter sighed. He grabbed it in his dirty, gloved hands, crestfallen eyes studying it. The precious diamonds that encrusted the silver, the gold etchings that read, "With you forever, to Shannon, forever." Where had it all gone wrong? His nose picked up on the distinct scent of a freshwater stream. At least he was getting closer. He had known about this area for a while now. It was all on his maps. He had at least done his preparations when he finally decided to leave his old life behind, but he had never been here before. He sighed in relief as he spotted the sight of the rapids, white foam churning around the jagged rocks. The constant rushing sound of the water that had filled the air for the past half an hour or so. Finally, he spotted movement on the banks. Stepping across the slick rocks with remarkable agility was a beautiful, dark-furred river otter. The hunter's hands grubbed against the wood of his bolt-action rifle as he took position against the trees. Taking a moment to confirm that he had the right ammunition, he aimed the gun. Deep breath, and he pulled the trigger. The graceful peace of these surroundings was broken by the deafening thunder crack of his rifle. Underneath the ruffling of a dozen fleeing birds, the hunter stood up, massaging his sore legs, before he carefully walked down to the stream to pick up his game. The river otter was, thankfully, already dead. He hoped it was as painless as possible. It was absolutely beautiful. He admired it, stroking its pristine, damp fur. Shannon would have loved it. Alive, obviously, but she loved otters. Badgers, beavers, and any little furred creature like that. She would have been surprised to see how big the river otters were. The next day, he decided that he would go to the lake. It was a beautiful sight, and he desired to see it again. He had gotten married with Shannon on the shores of a lake like this. The dream spot, the start to perfection. He couldn't sleep well anyway, maybe it would help. He spent the rest of the day sitting on a log, smoking his cigarettes and tidying up his thick, bushy beard a little. He would skip a rock or two into the lake. He could make it 6 skips. There was nothing better to do in the world than what he was doing, he thought. Except maybe being with her. He shot up from his log. No. But there it was, a figure. A person standing on the other side of the lake, strolling down the banks with carefree apathy. The hunter turned away, unzipping his backpack and snatching his cold binoculars from within, placing it to his eyes as he gave a wave and a shout. The figure glanced at him across the lake. It was a woman. Her skin was dark, her hair long and dyed blue. They were dressed in a long flowing white of a wedding dress. The binoculars fell from his hands, cracking against a rock. Shannon. That was her, in the exact same wedding dress. His heart beat hard against his ribcage as his mind raced, frenzied eyes staring at her, not daring to look away as he squatted down, and his hands desperately pawed at the soil and stones at his feet until he felt his binoculars. When he raised the binoculars to his eyes again, the cracked glass showed him the twisted, warped image of his ex-wife, slowly striding into the frigid blue waters of the lake, more and more of her slowly disappearing into the lake. "Shannon!" the hunter cried out. He lowered the binoculars, staring out into the vast expanse of the lake where his wife had now vanished to. Amidst the quiet stillness of the lake's surface, there now looked to be no sign of any life. Like something out of a dream, from the low mist near the surface emerged a hand, right in the middle of the lake. She shouldn't have been able to swim that fast. That wasn't possible. His voice was caught in his throat. Eyes widened, locked onto that lone hand, until the second hand had emerged and then her face. His wife was no longer wearing the veil or any semblance of a wedding dress, at least from her arms and head. But there she was, raising her index finger on her right hand and beckoning him towards her, into the bitter cold lake that he had never set foot in before. He took a step forward, feeling his boots nearly slip upon the wet soil and rock. She was right there, small in the distance that she was at, but it seemed she was so close. He would step in, swim to her, and get her back in his life. She took another step forward. He could hear her giggling, her gentle voice carried on the mist and winds into his ears. His right boot stepped into the water with a small splash, and immediately he felt something snap under his boot. He glanced on reflexively, only for a second, but when he returned his gaze upon her, she was only about 10 meters away. It was definitely her, every facial feature, the thin scar on her left cheek. "Shannon," he choked out. "I'm sorry." She nodded in reassurance, giving him a smile full of bloody otter teeth. He felt like he had just been shocked by a live wire. Instinct took over and he screamed, scrambling back up the lake shore, his boots slipping once or twice on the slick mud before he got back onto dry land. His hands flew for his gun and he whipped around with it, but there was no sign of his wife anywhere. The lake lay quiet, as if untouched by whatever thing had just swam in. "No, no, no," the hunter mumbled to himself, shaking his head to clear it. He hurriedly threw his backpack on and fled back through the woods. He passed his surroundings in a chaotic haze. Trees and rocks rushed past him as he sprinted and jumped across logs and shrubs. He had to get away from the lake, from that thing. He skidded to a stop, kicking up dirt and decaying leaves at the sight of the figure uphill to his left. "Mr. Emerson?" The hunter blinked. There he was, dressed up in that striped blue shirt, with the same cherry tie. The familiar wrinkled face that never smiled, staring at him with soulless eyes. The hunter could still hear his barking voice, yelling at him and the other truckers at any minute flaws in their timing and behavior. He remembered that glare, those beady black eyes silently cursing him when he put in his resignation after Shannon had left him. Mr. Emerson opened his mouth to yell again, to chew him up and spit him out. After he growled exactly like a brown bear, the deafening bellow vibrating deep into his bones, as Mr. Emerson's mouth stretched out wider than humanly possible. The insides, a bloodied, shifting fleshy mass of 100 different animals, before he suddenly got onto all fours and charged downhill at the hunter. There was not a second of hesitation before the hunter turned and ran, screaming at the top of his lungs. Behind him, he could hear the bounding of hands and feet in the grass, accompanied by these same horrific Urson roars. He could feel hot breath on his heels, the snapping of teeth just inches away from his boots. As he struggled to breathe, the world beginning to blur from exertion, he whipped around, raising his gun and pulling the trigger as hard as he could. The crack of the gunshot rang out, ringing in his ears. The bullet embedded itself inside a tree, but there was no sign of Mr. Emerson anywhere. No tracks or footprints but his own, and not a sound. His head was spinning, his heart pounding from terror and exhaustion. All around him, the fog seemed to limit his vision, these singing and screeching of birds and insects preventing him from hearing if there was anything trying to sneak up on him. Practically collapsing onto the log that he was using as a chair, he threw his backpack off and tended to the fire. A million questions raced through his mind. His thoughts kept returning to Shannon. Why was she at the lake in her wedding dress? And why was Mr. Emerson back to hound him once more, and the noises that he made? A part of him considered returning to the lake again, if it was really Shannon. He shook the thought out of his head. He was heading to the cabin tomorrow, and then getting the heck out back to civilization. There was something out here that didn't want him here, and he wouldn't be stupid enough to stay. Nights were scary to most out here, but he never found it that bad. Sure, there were animals like wolves out prowling, but they didn't go anywhere near humans, and especially not fire. So long as he kept his fire going, there wasn't much to worry about. He shivered as he shoveled some sardines into his mouth from a can. While it was definitely colder, there was a strange, musky otter smell too, and he cursed the otter that he had hunted yesterday. He had thrown it in a cooler box, but he wondered if the stench was worth it. His hands brushed past the necklace that he wore. The hunter gripped it, studying it, pondering and contemplating. Perhaps it was some curse that she had put on him. She was always into all the weird crystals and witchcraft stuff that he had brushed off as a harmless obsession. Tomorrow, he would have to keep a careful watch out for any more figures watching him. He pursed his lips. What if he died? What if on the walk to the hunting cabin tomorrow, he was dragged away by whatever the thing was? The question settled like an anchor in his heart. There would be no one to really mourn him. He had cut ties with everyone to come to Alaska. If he left a message, who would he even leave it for? A woman who now hated him. The hunter pulled out his video camera, grinding his teeth in anticipation as it booted up, before setting it to record himself. Through the screen, the darkness around him seemed all the more impenetrable. Hey Shannon, or whoever might find this. It's a beautiful night out here and it's starting to get cold and all, he said, quickly settling into the vlogging voice he used to do so often. I'm just tending the fire tonight. It's really beautiful out here. I'm repeating. Oh yeah, I got something to show you. He stood up, carrying the camera along with him. His face was shrouded in shadow, making for some pretty terrible footage, but he decided to let it keep playing as he reached into his tent and pulled out an astonishingly large caribou antler, freshly cleaned just a day ago. I didn't kill a caribou, I just kind of found it. Must have broken off, poor animal. And can you see it? Dang, this camera really sucks at night. Unevolved like my eyes. He joked as he pulled the antler into the open, where the warm, comforting glow of the fire lit it up. There, now you can see it. I'm just gonna chill here by the fire for a while, and then head into the tent to sleep. To Shannon, if you ever get this, just tell me if you still hate me. You probably do. I just wanted to say that I really hope you didn't send anything after me. The hunter paused, staring at the screen, watching his own face, shadowed by the movement of the flames, the darkness behind him a solid black sheet. Bye. He stopped the recording and switched the camera off, carefully slotting it into the camera bag and sliding it into his tent. The hunter sat back down at the log and stared into the fire for a moment. Beyond it, the forest barely allowed much moonlight in. He stared up into the trees, their branches stretching out like fingers of a dark god. One of them looked like there was some large creature sitting on it, staring at him. Dread creeped into him as slowly as the thing on the tree moved, when it stretched out its tail and limbs, and dashed downwards into the darkness, faster than any animal could move. He could hear the thing moving around his camp, its steps echoing into the forest. He gripped onto his gun. It wouldn't come close, he tried to reassure himself. Animals feared fire. Uneasily, he crawled towards his tent, knees scraping on the dirt and rocks until he huddled within the walls of a thin cloth. It was roaring, screeching, cawing, hissing, 1,000 different animal voices that were slowly pruned away until he could hear it on the other side of his tent. "I'm sorry, but it's not working out." Shannon's voice came from the other side of the tent. His eyes widened, the familiar words dragging him back to them standing in the kitchen, a cheese sandwich cooking in the oven. "No," he could only gasp. "You're just not respecting me enough. I'm gathering my stuff and moving to Maria's. I've talked to my lawyer. I'll be getting back to you," it said from the other side of the tent. "You freaking monster. Don't you dare go there," he warned, bitter hate swelling in his voice as he aimed his gun. It reached its hand out and pressed on the other side. It was her, even the ring she used to wear. "Don't yell at me about that. I don't want to hear it. I'm leaving right now," Shannon said. The hunter felt his left hand move almost uncontrollably, stretching out, yearning to touch her, to hold her hand again. Hot tears streamed down his cheeks as he shakily inched closer to her on the other side. "Please, please don't go," he begged. "Come out and join me." The voice broke from the script. The hunter froze, sitting with his left hand outstretched, right hand in the gun, staring at the silhouette of the hand on the tent, which slowly seemed to morph and warp as she pulled away. "It's this you want, isn't it?" The hunter yanked the cooler box open, gripping the rigid, frozen otter in his hand, and tossing it out of the tent, where it landed out of his constrained field of view. "Take it and leave me the heck alone. I'm sorry I killed it, just leave." The hunter stared into the deep abyss of the woods, at the all-consuming night that hid from view, the thing after him, that now concealed the approach of the dripping wet claws that sunk into the damp soil behind him, accompanied by the gnawing of vicious teeth on the bark of the trees. The hunter shrank ever closer to the fire, clutching onto his rifle like his life depended on it. A few meters away, he could hear his wife laugh, the comforting trill of her voice sending shivers down his spine as his finger rested on the trigger. Fire and gunpowder were the only things separating him from whatever hellish fate awaited, something that knew everything about him. That much he realized. All he needed to do was wait. Wait and pray. Pray that the light of the fire and the glint of the barrel of his gun was enough to stop the thing pretending to be his wife from reaching out a meter through the thin cloth of his tent and snatching him into the darkness. The hunter woke up with a start, yelling and swinging his gun like a club. Graceful warm sunlight streamed through the fabric of his tent and illuminated the wet soil and grass of his campsite. His heart pounding, the hunter emerged from his tent like a rabbit from a burrow, eyes darting left and right in the morning mist. His fire was still going mercifully, and he warmed up around it, rubbing his trembling hands. There was no sign of anything, the only sounds being a single singing bird, though that could be it, watching him from above. He stared up, and the tops of the trees seemed to stretch on higher than he thought into the peaceful sky. His attention was caught at the sight of his log, or rather, the giant otter paw prints in the soil right behind where he had been seated in the night. It was time to go. It took over an hour to properly pack what he needed, but with his backpack strapped on and walking stick in hand, he set off from his campsite. He had made it a few steps before something crunched under his boot. It was the otter that he had thrown out yesterday. It had been devoured ravenously, leaving only a few strips of it hanging onto its skeleton. Violent teeth marks were carved into the bone, and the otter had been ripped apart. Every animal call, every falling branch made him jump during his hike to the cabin. He followed the river upstream, the reverse of the path that had led him to his campsite in the first place. He didn't need a map. He knew the route very well. It took the rest of the day before he finally stepped under the creaking porch of the log cabin. Unlocking it with his key, he dropped his bag off by the door and locked it behind him. Removing his shoes and jacket, he boiled some water, set the fire going, and a few hours later climbed into bed. All safe now, he reassured himself as he pulled the blanket over him, sighing in relief. A snapping branch quickly shook him free of his misconception. In the dark tree line, he could see many reflecting shiny eyes, too many to count, but they quickly shifted, clumping and dissolving together until there were only two glowing eyes staring at him through the window. And then, like the wind, it was gone. He heard his porch creak, and then it spoke again, but not in the voice of Shannon anymore. He recognized this voice far more clearly. "So, hey, whoever is listening to this," came his vlogging voice from outside the cabin. "It's a beautiful night for hunting. The moon is covered in clouds and everything is asleep. I'm just on the prowl again, and now I'm going to slide underneath the doorframe." The hunter couldn't move. Every instinct in his brain was forcing him to stay absolutely still, and that he did. "Hey, and now I'm in. I've got something to show you. Let me just crawl on the ceiling for this one. We just need to find him. I know that he's awake. His vision is unevolved, the same as when his kind first walked here across the ice." The hunter could hear scraping on the ceiling on the other side of the log cabin, as well as the soft constant dripping of water onto the floor. He sat up, eyeing his gun by the fireplace. If he could just step off the bed and sprint over. "I'm under his bed." His voice came from under the bed. "I really hope he steps off, even just with 1 foot, and then I'll reach out and grab him." He didn't move an inch further. There was nothing but cold, helpless silence around him for a while. "Bye." The voice broke the silence just for a word before waiting again. The hunter pulled his leg back on. If he could just grab his gun, it seemed so close. Official report from Alaskan Department of Public Safety. State troopers in a search and rescue mission accidentally discovered the body of a man lying in his bed in a hunting cabin. Forensics determined that he had been deceased for at least 4 months. Cause of death: dehydration.